our theme for the conference, as you've heard many other speakers say, is the big picture. And I'm going to be throwing a very big picture at you, or more precisely, some picture frames, because the picture isn't fully sketched in yet of how the brain and mind work together and what in the world they have to do with how people learn vocal skill. But I'm going to be offering some pieces of that and why I think they're relevant to my experience of voice and to what we know about voice therapy. So I'll talk a little about the nature of the problem as I perceive it, some overview information on cognitive science, some selected concepts that appear relevant to voice therapy, and a few teasers of things that I hope other people younger and smarter than me will eventually be able to research. The image that you're looking at is called tensor diffusion imaging. It's one of the newer types of brain imaging, and it emphasizes networks and connections within the brain. And it kind of represents the fact that many of the concepts I'll be talking about also interact and overlap with each other. That's just the nature of the beast. Most voice science, as we think of it, addresses what I call the hardware of the vocal mechanism. How the vocal folds work, what they're made of, down to the cellular and even, as we've learned this weekend, down to the molecular layers. How they are put into action, both by neurology and by breath, and what kinds of sounds that hardware can produce. But voice therapy and training, I believe, require us to work through the software, which is the client's internal control of a uniquely hard to access region of the body, and a region of the body that is mediated by airway reflexes, deeply unconscious, that is mediated by emotion and personality, and by social identity and the kind of self that people are willing to present to the world. Voice therapy literature includes some investigations of software. There is information on counseling strategies, motivation, compliance, and clinician factors and personality variables are kind of mentioned, but we don't have a really comprehensive conceptual scheme. No, I am not going to be able to give you a fully comprehensive conceptual scheme, but as I say, a few pieces of some ways to look at that might eventually lead us to a clearer concept. So the perspectives from cognitive science won't answer everything, but they may help us to ask better questions. I'll be talking about the connection between objectivity and subjectivity, and so I'm going to take a subjective break and tell you about my first voice lesson. I was 11 years old, and believe it or not, I was a relatively shy, shut down, quiet kid, but I loved music and theater, and I was really excited when my family moved into a neighborhood where it turned out there was a theater teacher who rounded up the neighborhood kids every summer and put on a Shakespeare play in her backyard. And I got to audition. So I showed up, and a bunch of us spent the afternoon playing theater games and reading lines and trying stuff. And as it was getting dark toward the end of the summer afternoon, she said everybody can go home, but she asked me to stay behind. And when things kind of calmed down, she came over to me and said, very thoughtfully and carefully, "Now, dear, do you think that you could talk louder without shouting?" And I felt something turn over or flip over in the middle of my body that I'd never felt before. And I read the lines again, and suddenly I was talking louder without shouting. And I got a medium-sized part in the play. And there I am the next year at age 12, playing Ariel in The Tempest. And here I am many decades later, still wondering, how did that happen? What was going on in and around that simple verbal cue that changed a part of my body that I didn't know I had? It was probably in the region of my diaphragm, but I was 12. What did I know? And that's the kind of question that keeps me motivated. Because we have those moments when we give a certain cue and somehow the patient is primed and the message goes in somewhere and it lands somewhere and we get back what we're looking for and everything's great. And then we have those other moments when we try every possible cueing strategy and nothing seems to get in. They just don't seem available or accessible or willing to change or something. And we start wondering, is this psychological? Is this cognitive? Is this a different organic problem that I didn't realize? And we get very confused and we don't know really what to do because we don't know where the problem is. So that's the kind of question I'm trying to answer as I read neuroscience in my spare time. One of the aspects of this that I think is very interesting came from our esteemed colleague, Dr. Nelson Roy, who was interviewed on National Public Radio in 2010 and mentioned that functional dysphonias straddle the territory between mind and body. And that's a territory that medicine has a difficult time with right now. Well, if that territory between mind and body is where many disorders live, then that's where I go to work every day. And I feel pulled to try to understand it. It turns out that that territory between mind and body is not entirely uncharted because this field called cognitive science is already there and has been shining a bunch of flashlights around in what we thought was a black box. So what is cognitive science? It is a cross-disciplinary investigation of the nature of mind. And I'll be using mind and cognition kind of interchangeably, although the real geeks will, I'm sure, find lots of differences between those words. Some of the contributing disciplines to cognitive science are very familiar to us as speech therapists. Neuroscience, psychology, education and learning theories, and linguistics. But there are a couple pieces of the puzzle that are less familiar to us. One is philosophy, which is a long historical school that seeks to investigate how thinking works kind of from the inside. People cogitate on what is it that's happening when I think of something or sense something or perceive or process. And this has been going on for thousands of years. That's philosophy. And the last piece that'll be relevant is artificial intelligence, computer cognition, and how close or not close it is able to get to human cognition. As people from these different disciplines have gotten together to talk about cognition and the mind, some interesting evidence emerges from these different perspectives that brings some inherent challenges to the traditional clinical assumptions. For instance, that mind and body are separate, where in fact they seem to be more interrelated than that. And as I mentioned, there's a reconciliation of objective and subjective points of view, where psychology and philosophy bring more of a subjective point, and neuroscience and artificial intelligence and some of the others bring the objective. And people are finding ways to negotiate how those two points of view fit together. One working group tried to come up with a definition of mind that they could all agree on. And this is what they came up with. This is from a really nice introductory book that I recommend by Dan Siegel called Mind Sight. And he writes that mind is an embodied and relational process that regulates the flow of energy and information. An embodied and relational process. So mind isn't even a noun, it's a verb. It's a process. And embodied and relational are the two adjectives that I'm going to unpack a little more as we move. Some areas that appear relevant to voice therapy that I'll be talking about in a little more detail are a revaluing of the parasympathetic nervous system, the concept of embodied cognition. One of my favorites, just a nice mouthful to say, interpersonal neurobiology, which has a very important subtopic of clinical empathy. And finally, voice as a neurophysiological signal. So revaluing the parasympathetic nervous system. This is mostly an interplay between neuroscience and psychology. As you might remember from your neuro courses, the autonomic nervous system has two parts called sympathetic and parasympathetic. And the one that people know quite a bit more about, because it's been studied more in the last century, is the sympathetic system, what we call the fight, flight, or freeze response. The parasympathetic is its partner, the rest and digest system that's involved in nutrient absorption, cellular repair, sleep, and other restorative processes. So while the sympathetic system goes out into the world to fight, to flee, to mate, to find things to eat, the parasympathetic system is the housekeeper who cleans up after all of that effort. The sympathetic system is associated subjectively with excitement and arousal and fear and alertness and anxiety. The parasympathetic system is associated with safety, receptivity, satiety, and pleasure. Now, these are not opposite poles on a single axis. The parasympathetic system is a separate, complementary axis of regulation. So these two are not like white and black, they are like red and blue. They can be present in multiple combinations, they can both be elevated, they can both be reduced, and they actually co-regulate each other in some interesting ways. And this is just emerging as a topic of greater attention in the last few decades. It's an especially hot topic in psychotherapy, for anxiety management, trauma recovery, and there's a little bit of literature related to stage fright, which is of course relevant to our vocal performers. That one of the ways of helping people overcome anxiety and trauma is not just decreasing the sympathetic system, but increasing the parasympathetic system, which provides a sense of safety and security that allows them to go into some more dangerous areas. So an increase in parasympathetic activity is not the same as decreasing sympathetic, such as simple muscle relaxation, which many of us have learned about in our training. I want to tell you a story about a possible application of the parasympathetic system to voice work. As I was reading deeply, just because I like to read neuroscience, I attended a performing arts conference about a year ago, and a theater teacher presented a cool down activity that she had kind of invented from exercises she had learned, again experientially, subjectively, from different teachers. And there were the kinds of vocal activities you might expect, humming and trilling and relatively gentle vocal use, but there were also whole body processes. There were shaking movements and little rocking movements, some of which were done supine. There were little tapping massage all over the body, and there were affective cues toward pleasure and enjoying vibration and enjoying the sensations of the body and appreciating the performance that one had just done. And this teacher had found anecdotally that her graduate students, who instead of a final thesis project had to do 3 shows in repertory, and they might do a very intense Greek tragedy in the afternoon and then a musical theater show that night and keep up that kind of schedule for like 3 or 4 weeks, that after she instituted this cool down, there was much fewer complaints of vocal fatigue and injury. It's purely anecdotal. But as we were going through this and as she was describing it, I realized that all of those activities, the shaking and the rocking and the humming and the pleasure, lined up with what I had just been reading of ways to activate the parasympathetic nervous system. And so this gives us an entirely new frame. Instead of vocal cool downs being simply laryngeal activities to promote changes in the vocal cords, we might start to think of a whole body experience to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system and increase overall cellular recuperation, restoration, better sleep, and so on. So that's where I think some of these ideas could go and could cross over. A couple more tidbits about the parasympathetic system. Its primary mediator is our friend, the vagus nerve, cranial nerve 10. As a matter of fact, the laryngeal branches of cranial nerve 10 are the only somatic parts of cranial nerve 10. There might be a couple somatic fibers to the diaphragm as well, but all the rest of that nerve bundle is autonomic. Interesting. Parasympathetic function has been linked to interpersonal communication. There's a very strong influential theory in neuroscience from Stephen Porges, who uses a physiological measure of PNS activity and flexibility across situations called vagal tone. And this is associated with better communication skills, including voice and speech. It's even possible that an enhanced co-regulation of sympathetic and parasympathetic systems at heightened levels seems to correspond to subjective descriptions of stage presence, which is relevant to vocal performance and public speaking skills. And I've just published an article going into that at length in a theater arts journal that is in your references. Again, trying to find correspondences between this deep science and the subjective reports of what performing artists go through. So moving on to embodied cognition, or the notion of the mind as embodied. This idea got its start in philosophy, a 19th and early 20th century school of philosophy called phenomenology, which said that the act of thinking and abstraction is not just something that's completely separate from the rest of our lives, but that our day-to-day experience in a three-dimensional sensory world is part of cognition, is part of the mind, shapes how we think. And that the experience of taking action in the world is also a part of how we experience our thoughts and feelings. This contributed, for instance, to all of the learning by doing activities that you may have done with children or adults. So this is a very powerful school of philosophy. Now, in the 1980s, it became really important in the field of artificial intelligence, because it turns out that those direct body senses of living in a three-dimensional world, the sense of gravity, the sense of space and movement, as well as the special senses of sight and hearing, so those are things that any one-year-old child kind of has figured out. Things fall, I fall down, I need help getting up, things have weight, things have shape and texture. Computers have a really hard time with that. And so this notion of the body senses and the embodied nature of cognition was developed as a way to distinguish artificial intelligence from human intelligence. And some of the best writing on it comes from that computer field. The New York Times just announced the formation of a new robotics company called Embodied Intelligence, where we're going to make the robots that are smarter than any robots you've ever seen. And I knew that they'd pick that word, embodied intelligence, as a way to signal that we're getting closer to being like humans. I don't think they're ever going to quite get there, but that's how powerful this notion is. Now, incorporating psychology and neuroscience, everybody is coming around to agreeing that the mind knows it has a body. This is a direct challenge to the traditional divide between body and mind that dominates our clinical assumptions and practice, but that divide between mind and body was never based in evidence. You can go back and read the history of the 17th century. It was not grounded in anything we would call science. And in fact, the evidence from these many fields of cognition is going the other way. That the territory between mind and body is actually full of communication and interrelationship and crossover. The embodied nature of the mind is in fact very evidence-based. There's a part of the brain that's devoted to processing it, called the insula. And it is located kind of in between the auditory cortex and the frontal and parietal lobes, kind of tucked in between there. Conveniently close to the sensory motor strip, conveniently close to the limbic system where we experience the physiology of emotion as well as the affect of emotion, and conveniently close to auditory processing. That's interesting. The individual sense of embodiment, what I'll in a moment unpack as the subjective body, is malleable. It can be dysregulated and disconnected from conscious awareness by trauma, what psychologists call dissociation, and it can be enhanced and made more available to consciousness by mind-body practices. In relation to voice therapy, there are some pretty direct correlations. One explanation of embodiment from Sean Gallagher in a book called The Body and the Mind. He says that it includes the perceptual sensory experience of the body, conceptual understanding or beliefs about bodies, which is culturally mediated, and a personal or emotional attitude toward one's own body. And in an initial interview with a voice client, all of those things are present. We're kind of taking a read on this. The patient is telling us the sensory level, what sounds bad, what feels bad, what gets tired, what's not working. But they're also giving us clues about what they think is happening. What are their concepts about the body? What are their concepts about causality? And what kind of intervention they trust to fix it? Whether that's going to be pills or no pills ever. You know, these kinds of concepts about bodies. And then they're going to tell us something about their affect and how they feel about the disorder. And is it devastating? Is it a change of identity? Has it shifted their sense of their body in the world? Here's an alternative formulation that I like. This comes from a psychologist, Ken Wilber, the subjective body. He says the term body can mean the biological organism as a whole, referred to as it. This is the commonly accepted scientific view. But body can also mean, and for the average person does mean, the subjective feelings, emotions, and sensations of the felt body, which includes vital feelings and sensory motor awareness and is experienced as I. So one of my conjectures is that in voice therapy, the software, this locus of change that we're trying to get to, is the client's subjective body, where cognition, belief, sensation, affect, and identity somehow come together. A corollary of this is that voice therapy may commonly include internal cognitive goals related to the focus of attention, up or down regulation of sense information, alongside our external and behavioral goals. And one of the earlier presentations today on conversational therapy had a lot of focus on helping people to feel and recognize certain new kinesthetic sensations. Now, some of our cognitive goals may not be expressed that overtly to our clients, but I suggest that they're present anyway. They may occur before, during, or after a change in behavior. I'm not saying that this cognitive layer is a prerequisite, but perhaps a co-requirement or co-phenomenon that's worth investigating further. Just a few examples. In the irritable larynx syndromes, we are very clearly and overtly desensitizing and dialing down familiar sensations. We're helping people distract themselves from discomfort, reinterpret discomfort. Yes, I know that feels like phlegm, but it's really not, and if you keep clearing your throat, you'll make the irritation worse rather than better. And we're training them cognitive overrides and replacements for their discomfort. So we're kind of dialing back an oversensitivity. With many other interventions, for instance, with the overuse dysphonias and the squeezing, with muscle tension dysphonia, And in a different way with LSVT loud, we are helping people get more sensation, to tune into things they haven't felt before. Maybe it's an effort level, again, in a part of the body they've never thought about. So confidential voice, flow phonation, semi-occluded exercises where people are learning how to do less with their larynx and how to recognize what that's like. With loud, we're helping them do more, but they have to feel what that more feels like. With resonance, we're increasing their vibrotactile self-feedback and where to pay attention to get it, and combining that with effort level. We're often cueing people to be more aware of body posture, of the shoulders, of the jaw, of the rib cage, and of course we're helping people be more aware of what they're doing with their breath. So this concept of embodied cognition may help us understand the components of voice therapy that involve sensation, focus of attention, and a conscious change in internal regulation. A couple more points on this. The body senses are processed in present time. Psychologists use the term groundedness or presence. So cues to attend to these body sensations can help interrupt people who are kind of stuck on the past of what caused this, was my diagnosis right, I didn't like how the doctor treated me, or they're kind of stuck on the future. What if? How am I going to get through my show? What if it's not fixed? What are the other options that I could do other than therapy? So they're not fully in the room. And some very simple sensory cues of let's just stay here, find your breath, find your feet on the floor, suddenly, bam, we're both back in the room, able to proceed. One more little tidbit. I don't think I put this in the references, but if you're interested in how embodied cognition relates to language, just look up George Lakoff, Lakoff, and metaphor, and you'll find a lot of interesting writing, associating the sensations of the body as an ultimate reference domain of meaning and the root, he says, of all metaphor and meaningful imagery. And this might have some perspective on the uses of metaphor and imagery in vocal arts training, because they're trying to help people connect to the feeling of the body and then apply that to other behaviors. And moving on to interpersonal neurobiology. This is that second adjective. We had the mind as embodied and now the mind as relational. This refers to the ways in which social relationships and the brain interact to shape our mental lives. So cognition is now not just mind and body, but self to other. People respond to each other at deep physiological levels, some of them measurable. So our interpersonal dynamics, which have generally been expressed in subjective terms, actually have been found recently to have objective measurable correlates. Things like an infant-mother bond in nursing or cuddling, there will be a synchronicity of pupil dilation. Heart rate variability seems to be more coherent with people that we know and trust rather than strangers. These are relatively deep autonomic responses, unconscious, but connected to how we're interacting in our social relationships. And that what we perceive as good or bad communication actually corresponds to this neurobiological coherence or discongruity. This is a huge topic across psychotherapy. Norton Publishers has a whole series of about 24 books under the heading Interpersonal Neurobiology, Family Therapy, Couples Therapy, Trauma Recovery, Therapist-to-Patient Relationship, and so on. And a major subtopic that I want to go into a little further is empathy, what we call clinical rapport. Now, as Kitty Verdolini Abbott has given us in many of her seminars, there's quite a lot of research showing that throughout medical care, the patient perception of empathy leads to improved compliance and outcomes. The perception of empathy from a doctor might even affect the immune system. There's a lovely study that's quoted in Jennifer Ackerman's book on the common cold, where people who had bad cold symptoms who went to a doctor, if they experienced the doctor as having empathy for their symptoms, they got over their cold one day faster than the people who didn't experience empathy. So what that doctor brings into the room is actually affecting the patient's immune system, which is kind of spooky and kind of cool. So this is increasingly included in medical training, actual overt empathy training, and there are validated scores and scales available. Now, empathy turns out to be linked to embodiment. Some aspects of it are processed through the insula, that same area of the brain. And a clinician's sense of embodiment appears to increase their capacity for empathy and increases the perception by others that we are empathic. As Siegel puts it, people who are more aware of their bodies have been found to be more empathic. The insula is key. When we can sense our own internal state, the fundamental pathway for resonating with others is open as well. Now, the traditional speech therapy training of rapport occurs through a little bit of didactic material and then individual supervision and role modeling. We don't really have a conceptual or formal frame. But through cognitive science, we're getting some better training models. It turns out that empathy can be enhanced by subjective self-development practices and by objective data-driven practices. Again, we can go either way, we get to the same result. In the subjective mode, if you remember, the capacity for empathy, perception of empathy are related to embodiment. And we said earlier that embodiment is enhanced by mind-body practices. So doing your yoga, doing your Tai Chi, doing your athletics with a sense of mindfulness, spending time in nature, spending time with pets, singing, all those activities that help you feel integrated and whole as a mind-body organism are going to not only increase your sense of embodiment, but people are going to think that you're more empathic. Really cool. As Goldie Hawn said in our keynote speech, if we put the oxygen mask on ourselves first, we're better able to offer it to others. And this increased capacity for empathy will improve our patient receptivity and compliance and may improve our clinical outcomes. So this is all good stuff. But it may be a little too subjective for some of you who really demand evidence. So let's go to the evidence. This was described in a really nice pilot study on ENT residents, our friends and colleagues in Voice. Didactic material on the neurobiology of communication, the fact that there are these physiological coherences or not, was combined with viewing of videotaped doctor-patient interactions with real-time streaming data of neurobiological markers in both people. And so these doctors in training were able to see that in the easier conversations there was more physiological congruence, and where communication seemed to break down, there was a physiological disconnect. And so this evidence-based training was very well received by folks with a clinical mindset. Their empathy scales improved, and the initial data showed a slight trend toward improved patient satisfaction. And the author explained it. Now, this is all going to get real polysyllabic, but try to digest it because it's lovely stuff. An empathy and relational skills protocol focusing on the neurobiology and physiology of emotions augmented the concept of being nice by demonstrating the specific physiological and ameliorative effects on autonomic nervous system activity produced by empathic skills. Really nice stuff. In the psychotherapy literature, there's an emerging trend called what are called common factors, which relate to empathy, self-regulated presence, and that these may be as important in outcomes as any particular skill, technique, or school of practice. As Alan Fogel puts it, alignment of our conceptual self-awareness And our embodied self-awareness makes us a psychobiological co-regulator who enhances the sense of safety in the relationship and in the body, helping the client to maintain homeostasis in the subjective present. Since voice therapy seems very personal, very sensitive, very unfamiliar to our clients, kind of weird, kind of scary, it just seems to me that clinical empathy and our own ability to self-regulate our presence, our sympathetic parasympathetic balance seems highly relevant and useful. So moving to one final topic, and then I'll be wrapping this up. The possibility that voice itself is one of these neurophysiological signals. De Cesare et al. Found that processing of tone of voice involves the insula, among other areas of the brain, suggesting a possible link between the listener's embodied experience, perception of voice, and an empathic understanding of the psychophysiological state behind that voice. So if I go to a concert because I love how that singer makes me feel, that singer's voice may be processed through my own sense of embodiment, triggering physiological changes that I find appealing. And that's why I go to hear them. And we're just starting to understand how that might work. Porges's work on the autonomic fibers of the vagus nerve says that they influence the laryngeal branch, that this very close anatomical relationship within the nerve bundle creates a very high likelihood of crosstalk, and that this may help explain the visceral impact of voice on listeners. And I was lucky enough to be kind of introduced, and he sent me the following statement through email. The voice is a transparent indicator of our physiological state and an extremely, if not the most potent trigger of the physiological states of others. And this is a guy who studies neurophysiology. And gratefully, he is interested in voice and breathing and communication. So we're finally suggesting, in my hypothesis, a pathway through which listeners perceive vocal signals at an autonomic level, and how we empathically re-embody the speaker's or singer's own internal state. Now, elsewhere in cognitive science, there is a well-documented phenomenon of mirror neurons that link visual processing to a motor response. I see someone do an action, my motor cortex lights up in parallel as if I were doing that action. This was proven in monkeys in the 1980s, and it's now been applied to all kinds of visually imitative learning. So I'm hypothesizing that there is a network linking auditory processing to visceral response, which would be conceptually parallel to mirror neurons, but structurally and functionally different. And I've suggested the term echo neurons. So what happened in my voice lesson? Was that teacher who said, "Can you talk louder without shouting?" Was she perhaps presenting a nonverbal model of diaphragmatic breathing that I just picked up and copied without knowing it? Did her autonomic nervous system communicate to mine through these empathic neurobiological channels, sending a sympathetic message, it's really urgent that I do what she's asking, and a parasympathetic message that it's safe and it's okay for me to try something unknown? Or do we just write this off as instinctively good teaching, the right words and tone of voice at the right time, which we would also call in speech pathology literature a good personality match or an undefined clinician variable? I'm okay not fully knowing what happened when I was 11, but I think that we and our clients will benefit from more understanding of what makes our training moments successful and what happens when they break down. So the questions that I suggest for future research, going back to the parasympathetic nervous system, can whole body cool downs oriented towards systemic recovery through the parasympathetic system help to prevent vocal injury. From embodied cognition, does a concept of the subjective body help us to experience the patient's experience and the challenges of undergoing voice therapy? Can we move beyond this strict behaviorist model where internal processing is an unknowable black box and recognize and investigate the cognitive processes, the adjustments to attention and sensory regulation that seem to be involved in vocal change, but that we haven't had a good language to describe? From interpersonal neurobiology, can we improve and formalize empathy training for speech pathologists in order to improve outcomes? And might this be especially important in the field of voice? Do clinician variables, including practice of mind-body activities outside the therapy room, enhance our embodied empathy and help the client feel grounded and safe enough to alter their internal subjective reality? And finally, is voice in itself a neurophysiological signal? Is there a functional relationship between the autonomic vagus and its somatic laryngeal branch? And might there be an echoneuron network of auditory to visual, visceral connections that helps to explain the unique power of vocal communication and vocal performance? At the very least, Roy's territory between the mind and body reemerges as a territory of co-regulation, complex interrelationship, which is already beginning to be understood. And these insights from cognitive science may help to illuminate what we've called the soft skills of therapy that have seemed unexplainable or off limits, and that also can add many useful new questions. So I suggest cognitive science as the next frontier of voice science. I will stick around for questions. Thank you.